Today we're going to talk about the development of Protestantism in the 20th century. All of a sudden, across the board, not only with Protestants, but every religious group, the 20th century, specifically the second half of the 20th century, religious adherence rates, church membership, and affiliation jumps up to where we haven't ever seen it before. So what happened? What were the causes and the conditions and the outcome of such a new popularity of religion for America in the later half of the 20th century?
What's the difference between a revolution and a revival? What do both have to do with a culture? And what do both say about the status quo, about those who are in power, and about those who are not? What does it take to have a revolution or a revival? What are the necessary components of that for anything to massively change? The post-World War II period saw a tremendous shift in American religious identity. The 1957 Census Bureau indicated that more than 96% of Americans cited a specific religious affiliation in response to the question, "What is your religion?" That number is tremendously high. While we know that a good number of people would answer that question without necessarily attending a particular church, the fact that they identified themselves with one group or another, as opposed to a response of no affiliation, is remarkable and is not something that we saw a century earlier. So what happened to create such a shift? Some may look at a new emphasis on religious life as a product of the religious landscape of what came before it. Looking at the 19th century is not a bad place to start, but the 19th century saw one series of awakenings or revivals all over the country, but the impact, while significant, was still largely limited and diverse. We know that the late 19th century and early 20th century saw another shift in religious consciousness of Americans with the emphasis on health and wealth. But outside of certain circles, a large number of Americans were still a bit more cynical about these growing religious movements. For example, Taft was under fire for being a Unitarian, and movements such as Unity and the Theosophical Society, Shiloh, and Firebrand Holiness Associations were intriguing, but were never adopted across the entire United States. Most of these groups had a small pocket of adherents and were known more for largely impacting larger movements than being a large movement standing on their own. Some then turned their attention to the Great Depression as a cause for religious growth. It would be logical to see that when earthly security drops away, people might turn towards heavenly security. Many would look at the Panic of 1837 as a leading cause for the millennialism, that is, the end of the world coming, which produced both the Millerites and the Adventists and the Mormons. But is this really the case? Is this the leading cause for the 20th century? Both the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression saw a great number of new techniques used to draw people into church. Things didn't change too much. Beginning in the 20s, there was a notion that you had to market religion much like you would market any other product that was now being sold all over America. We saw this with Moody to a certain extent, but Moody's missionary sugar was not nearly as extreme as others, whose new mantra was early to bed, early to rise, preach the gospel, and advertise. Lewis Mudge, at a Presbyterian General Assembly, stated that selling religion, that is the only business of the church. He then gave those present 5 different techniques to best sell their goods. The Methodist Zion Herald had a similar message. The old idea that a minister is above stooping to commercial devices must disappear, he said, if the church is to grow. He added that ministers are salesmen with a wonderfully fine line to sell to their congregations. Bruce Barton wrote a biography called The Man That Nobody Knows in 1925, where Jesus was pictured as a salesman, a psychologist, an executive, who then transformed 12 men from fishermen into a new management team. New slogans were placed upon marquees and magazines to entice people to attend church. A common slogan was to identify a church as a friendly church. Others stated, "Be a sport, come to church," or even, "Worship increases your efficiency," and "Business success and religion go together." New sermons were delivered to entice people, such as "The Irishman of the Old Testament," "Two in a Bed," "The Mae West of My Bible." Buildings themselves became a way of drawing people in. In 1921, the total money spent on new church buildings in the U.S. was $60 million. In 1926, that number jumped up to $284 million. Some groups did well with this, including the Jehovah's Witnesses, who saw an uptick in sales of the Watchtower magazine sold by themselves. Unfortunately, most denominations faced schisms at the same time related to fundamentalism, liberalism, and Pentecostalism. Charles Fisk, an Episcopal bishop, lamented in 1928 that there was evidence of a sad disintegration of American Protestantism. When the Depression hit, many of the churches that were dependent upon marketing and affluent members failed to adapt and ended up shutting down. The greatest success story from a marketing position that existed before the Great Depression is the Moody Bible Institute, or MBI. While denominations and universities began fighting over theology, MBI, while always remaining evangelical, made a conscious decision to side with the more respectable side, that would be the fundamentalists down the line of Torrey and others, instead of the more radical Pentecostals. Economically, this was a good decision, though this might not have been the decision that Moody would have made if he was still alive. In all likelihood, he would have tried to still steer a sort of middle course between the two, which would have probably not helped the school grow to become what it did. As the 20th century went on, the Moody Bible Institute became known as one of the fundamentalist schools. But it didn't start out that way under Moody. And its shift demonstrates a transition that occurred not only among evangelicals, but also Christianity as a nation and the nation beyond just that. The shift is really a result from two men. The first we've met before, and the second will be new, but is actually far more influential for this difference. The first man is Torrey. Torrey succeeded Moody in many things, but their doctrinal dispositions were rather divergent. Throughout the 20th century, Moody's school shifted form and took on a more fundamentalist character than Moody ever would have been comfortable with. Surprisingly, naming Torrey as the new president was not the major catalyst in this change, as Torrey left Chicago in 1912 and founded the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, today known as Biola. This is the place where the fundamentals were published in 1917, and this is the place of growth of fundamentalism, is oddly enough in LA, not just Chicago. In 1900, the Chicago Bible Institute officially became the Moody Bible Institute. Torrey took up a preaching tour, and the Board of Trustees tried to remove him over Torrey's stance concerning faith healing. In 1901, Henry Parsons Cromwell was called to help rescue the school from its financial difficulties and was named to the board. This is really the shift that we will see with MBI. Cromwell was a businessman who founded Quaker Oats and revolutionized the oat industry. In a time when most oats were sold by the barrel and competition reduced the prices of the commodity to little more than its manufacturing cost, Cromwell repackaged his oats into 2-pound sealed containers with the iconic Quaker on the cover. The Quaker was shown holding a scroll with the word pure on it. Of course, this implied that the bulk competition was not pure, And before long, Quaker Oats dominated the market, buying up all of the competition. Cromwell did the same at MBI. He began consolidating power as he was elected to the MBI Executive Committee in February of 1903, and then president the following year. Inasmuch as Moody was a businessman, Cromwell was a chief executive officer. Cromwell drafted a new plan of operation that transformed the way the school functioned. A new bureaucracy was put into place with new managers who received commensurate salaries to the public sector. The corporate structure was initially modeled after the YMCA because that's what Moody knew. It had several rules that followed the Y, including a board that had 15 people on it, and 6 to 9 of them were women. The board was dissolved when Cromwell took over, and he gave all of this authority to a new board of trustees. Then most tasks were then reduced even further to a 3-person executive committee. Cromwell wrestled control over the institute, and it paid dividends. By 1910, MBI was a central hub for fundamentalists. Nearly every publication, organization, and conference that contributed to the nationwide movement had direct connections to MBI, its personnel, and their close allies. Cromwell's business practices were echoed in the world of evangelical Protestants. Following the publication of the Fundamentals, this was given as a free pass to every church that wanted a copy. Cromwell and MBI used modern promotional techniques to bypass the authority of traditional religious institutions, transforming denominational affiliation into an identity signaling mere stylistic preferences. Fundamentalism and evangelicalism became the only alternative to modernism. Moody became the face of this much more so after he passed. The choice for most American evangelicals was Moody or modernity. Like the Quaker on the Oats, Moody's face and his legacy was lent to the fundamentalist cause, to the point that he is often called the father of fundamentalism, though he would have opposed many of the theological and social aspects of the movement, such as the introduction of racial segregation and the transformation of women's roles as students and trustees in the institutes. Cromwell tapped into Moody's disregard of denominations and promoted study as an evidence of practical faith. The faith was soon wrapped up with the Keswick revival of England and dispensationalism. The merger of these two ideologies gave respectability to MBI evangelicals over and against the emerging Pentecostals and created a new corporate evangelical. Unlike Moody, whose revivals focused on the working class and promotion of social stability, the corporate evangelical focused on the working class, consuming religion and all other goods that are consumed by rational individuals. Individualism and choice were maintained within the evangelical system, and proof for this lies in the consumption of certain goods and ideas. Instead of about serving the poor, it became about consumerism, the very ideas promoted at MBI. The new evangelical system promoted consumerism just as any other business did. Still, under Cromwell's direction, which he held on to until his death in 1943, Moody Bible Institute became a corporate evangelical school, as much as was on the cusp of transforming and reacting to the right wing of American Protestantism. The National Association of Evangelicals, the National Religious Broadcasters and Christian Booksellers Associations, as well as Fuller Theological Seminary, all came from the Midwest's premier Bible institution.
The National Association of Evangelicals, or the NAE, was formed in 1942 under the leadership of Harold J. Okenga.
Growing from MBI, the attempt was to consolidate not only the more extreme fundamentalists, but also the moderate fundamentalists, who were the greatest number of fundamentalists. Okenga worked under the decision that racked many of the moderates, Moody or modernity, and he continued to push this. While not Moody per se, the NAE capitalized on the growing distaste for modernity and was able to persuade denominations that were historically outside of the fundamentalist camp. Thus, the name evangelical dominated, and the term fundamentalist was increasingly avoided. Other terms such as the born-again movement were also used. Evangelicalism continued to rise to the point that Newsweek labeled in 1976 that year as the year of the evangelical. That year was not only the election of Jimmy Carter as president, who himself was an evangelical, but Charles Colson's autobiography, Born Again, was at the top of the bestsellers list. Black Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver also converted to evangelical Christianity. Additionally, Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, and a whole host of other American celebrities, athletes, and politicians had their born-again experience. In 1977, famed pornographer Larry Flynt also publicly converted, although he continued to put out Hustler magazine. While many of these celebrities' conversions were not super long lasting, that does show a certain mood and attitude that the country had, and the growing, not only palatable nature of evangelicals, but a desire to become a part of that group. Just as MBI and the National Association of Evangelicals and various holiness associations partnered together, we have a similar movement amongst the mainline churches at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1908, the Federal Council of Churches was organized in Philadelphia, consisting of 33 different Protestant denominations. The name was later changed to the National Council of Churches. The goal was ecumenical and political. The first public declarations stated their commitment to social reforms along the lines of the social gospel message addressed earlier. Doctrinally, the preamble of their constitution stated, quote, "The essential oneness of the Christian churches of America and Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior." The long-term goal was unification, to erase the denominational titles and lines. While this sounded promising, many dominant groups, such as the Southern Baptists, did not join them. As a result, the Federal Council of Churches was only significant for those Protestant churches that chose to join them. The vast majority would be identified as mainline rather than the evangelical or Pentecostal groups that we see rising up outside of them. Another reason for the ecumenism of mainline Protestants was the urbanization of the early part of the 20th century. The common goals of the social gospel encouraged cooperation. Once the urban problem was addressed, these same denominations looked at rural churches and sought to address the needs there as well. An attempt to convert, assimilate, and merge the great number of rural churches under larger denominational concerns presented a solution to a perceived religious anarchy on the frontier, and as a way of growing the denominations themselves that were losing numbers to the rising number of evangelicals. The greatest example of this was the founding of the Interchurch World Movement, or IWM, in 1919. Detailed plans, along with corresponding justifications, were drawn up for rural church mergers. The main justification was that the mainline denominations were losing not only member churches in the rural areas of America, while independent holiness, Baptist, and Pentecostal churches were growing. Ecumenism seemed like a great solution to stop the exodus, which affected the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Congregationalists. Mainline cooperation led not only to rural mergers, but denominational mergers within the mainline as well. Several different Congregationalist churches joined together. The same happened with the Presbyterians and the Methodists. There were even mergers and agreements between denominations where they shared communion and plans to draw up a merger into one larger body, though this never took place. Typically, mergers took place within denominations, and then with whatever other church bodies resembled them closest in their theology. As such, broadly construed liberal churches merged with other liberal churches. We have similar movements happening amongst evangelical or more conservative churches with them as well. Mergers seemed and served as one major technique of the main line in combating the diffuse voices of evangelicalism in the early 20th century. Another method was to use modernity to their own benefit and their advantage. The main line had already adopted many modern media to advance their message, and the newest media was the radio, and later in the 20th century, the television. The hope was that modernity itself would provide the tools to stay relevant and ensure engagement with Americans as they too wanted to market their religion. The growth and acceptance of evangelicalism may have come down to an issue of marketing. Honestly, they just marketed their religion better. Marketing was essential for the NAE, MBI, a whole host of individual churches and parachurch organizations, as well as people. The media becomes an important tool for who's going to win the hearts and minds of the people over the 20th century. While today we might associate media engagement with evangelicals, this was not the case early on. The National Council of Churches, which was largely a liberal association, or mainline if you'd prefer, dominated radio and television by pushing out evangelical voices. They marginalized them and made it expensive and hard for them to do. The FCC had a policy in the 1920s that to ensure licenses for public broadcasting stations, they were all required to dedicate a certain percentage of their airtime to community service. Religious programming was understood as a public service and would fulfill this requirement, and had the added benefit that it was rather cheap to produce. The NCC, the National Council of Churches, convinced stations to only reach out to their member churches as they were respectable and mainline, as opposed to an extreme view that might cause division rather than to serve the public. The result was that only mainline Protestants got free airtime. All airtime was run through the Department of the Religious Radio of the National Council of Churches, and they approved of what would be allowed to be broadcast in America. Those churches that did not join the National Council of Churches, if they wanted to have any airtime, had to pay for it. Beginning with CBS in 1927, though they stopped actually selling to any religious organizations not that much longer into 1931. The mutual broadcasting system continued to sell commercial time to religious broadcasters, which allowed for paid evangelical and other religious voices on radio and later a little bit into TV. Famously, Charles E. Fuller had the old-fashioned revival hour. There was also a Missouri Synod Lutheran show, the Lutheran Hour, and Voices of Prophecy was paid for by the Seventh-day Adventists. To try to squash the persistence of non-NCC religious broadcasting, pressure was put onto the FCC and to Mutual, who eventually in 1944 adopted a new set of rules which marginalized more the evangelical voices. The first was that you could no longer solicit funds to pay for the broadcasts. People used to have as regular part of their broadcasts a commercial at the end saying, hey, you want to keep more of this show up? Mail in some money because we can't afford it otherwise, or give it to denominations and use the radio as a sort of form of commercial advertising too. And in 1944, that was no longer allowed. Additionally, the shows could not run longer than 30 minutes, many of which beforehand lasted an hour or 2 hours or sometimes even longer. The time slot that was also available for religious broadcasting was also shifted to Sunday mornings only. This is a time when most evangelicals would have been at church, and so your viewership, or those who would hear your radio broadcasts, those total numbers naturally would have been rather diminished. As such, it seemed that the NCC staged a very successful coup in 1944, and that their voices alone would be the ones that would dominate into the 20th century. But we know that this is not what happened. What happened was that the evangelicals pushed back against this stranglehold over airtime. This resulted in circumventing the entire system. Instead of paying for commercial time with the large networks, they instead invented a practice that's used by radio and TV today called syndication, where they purchase time not with the major broadcasters, but with local stations. Local stations needed the money and said, that's great, and sold time. These new rules didn't apply then. This meant that the evangelicals who wanted to broadcast needed to raise even more money than they would have had to do before. And of course, they were doing this on the air and were allowed to do so since this was not governed from a national FCC policy, but individual radio stations or television stations would negotiate this and made it okay. It was like any other form of selling any other product. So of course, if you have an infomercial, you can have a religious infomercial. This became the new way of doing things. Local stations thought this was great. They also, the evangelicals, created the National Religious Broadcasters, or the NRB. This was a new unified body that would push back against the NCC to defeat the FCC. When TV showed up, the NCC tried to do the same thing that they did with radio, but the NRB and the evangelical broadcasters continued to practice syndication, and they went directly to the local stations who continued to allow their growth. In 1960, the FCC ruled that local stations had to replace free religious time with paid broadcasts. That old requirement that you would have community service and religious broadcasting now went away, in part because evangelicals didn't like it because they were squeezed out. The evangelicals had operated under the model of being a paid broadcaster pretty much from the beginning, and at least for several decades. But the mainline Protestants didn't know how to make this work. They were used to the free airtime. As a result, they slowly died away, while the evangelicals grew to dominance as far as the religious broadcasting market. When cable emerged, evangelicals had their own cable channels. By 1980, 20% of radio stations were classified as religious and 4% of TV stations. 75% of radio and 90% of TV programming was produced by evangelicals or Pentecostals. Following this, we have many popular televangelists which utilized media to their advantage. The biggest names are those such as Jerry Falwell's Old Time Gospel Hour from Lynchburg, Virginia, Rex Humbard's Cathedral of Tomorrow from Akron, Ohio, Pat Robertson's 700 Club from Virginia Beach, Virginia, and an offshoot from the 700 Club, we have Jim and Tammy Faye Baker's PTL Club from Charlotte, North Carolina. PTL initially stood for Praise the Lord, but it was later said that it actually meant people that love, and a sort of rebranding. Some detractors used to joke that PTL stood for Pass the Loot instead, as the show was on over 200 stations and 3,000 cable outlets, and in 1979 brought in a weekly revenue of $1 million, a number that was unheard of by most others at this time. The message was not always religious. For example, Jerry Falwell is also known for founding the political group The Moral Majority. This happened in 1979. The group enrolls voters and has clergy serve as precinct captains. Falwell's TV show served as a bridge for political change as well. This is not terribly different than what was done by social gospel advocates at the beginning of the 20th century, but with the exception of the media. It's no longer books and magazines, but TV and radio and easier to deliver. As we see played out in the fights over airtimes, the 20th century witnessed a theological reassessment. The battle lines were over theological approaches to modernity. The fundamentalists, as well as other evangelicals, including the Pentecostals, laid down a challenge to the mainline denominations. The argument was not over the same questions as existed in the late 19th century, but increasingly on how to engage in the new trends and ideas concerning theology and modernity itself. In many ways, these new trends did not directly impact the evangelical set immediately. They saw much of the early debate as a catastrophe of modernity, and any expression of modernity as a concession. The main expressions were identified as neoliberalism and neo-orthodoxy. Neither side would view what they were doing as a concession. Rather, they were trying to remain faithful to their own traditions. The face of neoliberalism was Paul Tillich. Tillich saw modernity as a rejection of traditional theology and belief in the Bible. He said, quote, "Many of those who reject the Word of God reject it because the way we say it is utterly meaningless to them." His attempt was to say what was in the Bible in a way that fit with modern times and would speak to a 20th century audience. Tillich was born in Germany in 1886. He received his doctorate in 1911 and in 1912 was ordained a Lutheran pastor. He also served as an army chaplain in the First World War. He believed that the main cause for the cataclysm of the war was greed. The result is that he became a Christian socialist and sternly criticized the evils of capitalism. When the Nazis gained control of Germany, he was opposed to them too. As a result, he made his way to New York and began a position at Union Theological Seminary, thus becoming a leading American theologian. Tillich and his liberal theology tried to address practical concerns, much as we saw with the social gospel. He saw that American Protestantism was possessed by a demonic absolutism which throws the truth like stones at the heads of people, not caring whether they accept it or not. End quote. Tillich continues arguing, quote, "The church not only does not expand, but even loses what it has, because its members also live within the given civilization and can receive the verity of the message of the new being only within the categories of that civilization." The notion of the new being really serves as the linchpin for Tillich's ideas and his theology. For him, all Christian theology is based on the unique event of Jesus Christ and the spirit of the infinite meaning of this event. It remains this event, and as such, the criterion of every religious experience. This event is given to experience and not derived from it. Therefore, he says, experience receives and does not produce. What it receives is an ontological change. From the incarnation, man becomes new. As a Lutheran, he expressed this change on a personal level through faith. He says, quote, "Faith means being grasped by a power that is greater than we are, a power that shakes up and turns us and transforms us and heals us. Surrender to this power of faith," was his message. In the Dynamics of Faith, Tillich gives his famous definition of faith and God as ultimate concern. Quote, "Faith as ultimate concern is an act of total personality. It happens in the center of the personal life and includes all its elements. Faith is the most centered act of the human mind." This notion of faith is remarkably similar to that of Schleiermacher, a 19th century German, and his notion of the feeling of absolute or utter dependence. Both ultimate concern and absolute dependence consume their totality of the individual and mark the object as greater than the individual. Tillich continues that, quote, "Where there is faith, there is awareness of holiness. Therefore, what concerns one ultimately becomes holy. For Tillich, this notion brought the holy back into dialogue with man. For his critics, this moved the absolute God into the realm of the subjective. But for Tillich, it meant God was now approachable in a way that fit with modernity without rejecting it, and could still be genuine faith. Surprisingly, the neo-Orthodox response was not to eliminate the subjective, but to approach it from a different light. The attempt of neo-Orthodoxy was to return to the theological debates surrounding the Reformation and bring those debates into the 20th century, reinterpreting them for the 20th century context. The attempt, as the name implies, was to emphasize both what was new and what, from a Protestant perspective, was orthodox, that is, the right teachings of the Church. This meant shifting the focus back onto God's transcendence, contrary to Tillich's emphasis on the immanence of God. In other words, God is big versus God is close. God's transcendence means that grace is necessary. Many different theologians contributed the rise of neo-orthodoxy, including Americans Reinhold and Richard Niebuhr, as well as Europeans such as Emil Brunner and Rudolf Bultmann. But the largest name in neo-orthodoxy is Karl Barth. While Swiss-born, his work in theology impacted circles in America. Like Tillich, Barth was born in 1886. Though Barth was Reform and not a Lutheran, he also was ordained and fell into Christian socialism, even arguing that real socialism is real Christianity and that all true Christians must be socialists. He later opposed socialism, beginning with the violence and the violent techniques that he saw growing from the Soviets and the Third International. While Tillich saw the incarnation as the expression of the immanence of God, Barth saw this as the transcendence of God, that Christ remained wholly other. Barth declares, quote, God is known as the unknown God. Still, both emphasize the new creation as the bridge which allows for man to engage with God. In 1962, Barth went on a speaking tour in the United States. Here, Barth criticized liberal theology when he said, quote, that man as man is not only in need, but beyond all hope of saving himself, that the whole of so-called religion, and not least the Christian religion, shares in this need, and that one cannot speak of God simply by speaking of man in a loud voice. This last bit is a sort of quote that you'll see a lot from him, that you cannot speak about God just like talking about man in a louder voice. Barth's neo-orthodoxy allowed for many mainline theologians to reclaim the Reformation and many of the theological claims of the fundamentalists without rejecting some aspects of modernity. They could maintain the transcendence of God and the need for people and cultures to be transformed by an encounter with God. One easy example to see how the theological reassessment fractured any notion of unity can be seen in the various Lutheran bodies in America. Today, there are three major groupings of Lutherans and dozens of smaller groups. The history of the Lutherans, from their beginning in the United States, and more so in the 20th century, is a history of different groups splintering and regrouping over and over again. The largest group of Lutherans in the United States is the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and it traces its origins to several different groups of Germans and other Lutherans. The ELCA was officially formed in 1988, though it had a long history of other denominations, groups, and synods that ended up culminating in 1988 as a result of the merger of three large Lutheran groups: the American Lutheran Church, the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, and the Lutheran Church in America. Broadly speaking, this is the mainline Lutheran body and is more liberal than the other forms of Lutheranism. The ELCA embraced theological liberalism. As a result, they have liberalized or modernized some practices, including the ordination of women and open communion. They have this formally with 6 other Protestant bodies and informally with a lot of other people, depending on what the pastor deems necessary, as well as the belief that the Bible was inspired but not inerrant. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, or LCMS, also consisted of German Lutherans, mostly from Saxony, but their history is very different than the history of the ELCA. Their history represents a stance within a theological reassessment. They came to America in part over a protest concerning a reform in Lutheran union that was tried to push upon the Lutherans in Saxony. Essentially, those who became the Missouri Synod showed up in an attempt to try to preserve what they saw as pure Lutheranism in America. The LCMS was headed up by Reverend Dr. C.F.W. Walther, 1811 to 1887, who served as the first president of the synod. They are the second largest body, about a third the size of the ELCA today. The third major Lutheran body is the Wisconsin Synod. The Wisconsin Synod traces its roots largely to Norwegian and other Scandinavian immigrants. It is the smallest of the large Lutheran bodies. It's about a fifth of the size of the LCMS. Theologically, they are more conservative and would align on most issues with the Missouri Synod. So we see this sort of mix of Lutherans and Lutherans and Lutherans and countless other smaller bodies that are not a part of one of these three. And it's not that they fundamentally disagree on the aspect of who Luther is or that even that church tradition, but are you going to be more conservative or liberal with your approach to your own church tradition, as well as the notion of the Bible and what they would say is important for that tradition? Following World War II, America turned to religion more than at any period in its past. Unlike the First or Second Great Awakenings, this period of increased church attendance was largely formless. It found expression in a number of different avenues. Church membership rose to nearly 65% of the national population. The 1957 census discovered that 96% of the nation's citizens identified themselves with some religious tradition, 30% or so not attending any particular church. Of the 120 million Americans at the time, 70 million were Protestant, 30 million were Catholic, nearly 4 million were Jews, and only 4% of the population had no religious identity at all. Additionally, this time period saw an explosion of building projects. New churches were built and were built to look new. The purchase of Alaska in 1867, with its Russian Orthodox and Native populations, as well as the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, with its mix of Asian and indigenous communities, only widened the American religious alternatives that existed. With the exception of landmark Baptist churches, most Protestant denominations affected by the camp meetings and the holiness movement of the 19th century slowly found a degree of peace with other denominations. This did not mean that doctrine did not matter, but the lines of division at the beginning of the 20th century were more upon doctrinal liberalism, holiness, and Pentecostalism, rather than confessional identity. With the founding of the National Association of Evangelicals in 1942, evangelicals signaled that they were also open to some degree of ecumenical dialogue. The suburbanation of post-World War II America rapidly accelerated the push towards ecumenism, or interdenominational churches. This took the form often of what is identified as a community church. While initially proposed by mainline denominations, the form of community churches quickly favored evangelicals, primarily those of a Baptist leaning. Another fruit of interdenominational cooperation is the rise of non-denominational churches. In essence, modern non-denominational churches are Baptist churches without formal adherence to a convention. Like other Baptist churches in America, they are congregationalist in structure. They are local, and they work with other churches only insofar as they decipher a like spirit. As Baptist churches in America are really not a denomination, but a convention of individual churches, the non denominational churches adopt this model, but typically do not have a convention or a larger ecclesial structure outside of some potential fidelity to a mother church or a small network of churches that they would say are like minded. Often, these do not hold any ecclesial authority over the local church and are perfectly fine with splitting off of another one for any sort of number of reasons. Additionally, most non denominational churches also believe very similar things concerning the nature of sacraments, missiology, and salvation as Baptist churches do. Though without any ecclesial oversight, some of the beliefs can differ wildly, including some on what we might consider basic issues. As of 2025, most estimates place the number of non denominational or independent churches in the US at around 44,000. As a group, they are the largest Protestant grouping, even though they're not together, in the United States, ahead of the Southern Baptist Convention. One hallmark of most non denominational and evangelical churches is the altar call. While the altar call may differ wildly depending on the church, many of which have a specific prayer that is required to become saved. Surprisingly, most churches that prioritize the altar call don't have an actual altar. Rather, they are borrowing the notion of the altar from the Bible and temples having altars and Phoebe Palmer's altar theology. The modern altar call includes what's commonly known as the sinner's prayer. The prayer is a call to accept Christ into your heart. This is usually the phrase that's attached with it. This is the end product of a long history of American revivalism. It is connected to the anxious bench of Finney and the altar theology of Palmer, as well as the on the spot conversions that we find with Moody, as well as his revival's inquiry rooms, where those who wanted to learn more can speak with counselors. At the beginning of the 20th century, this shifted again with new people such as Billy Sunday. Sunday was a famous baseball player who converted to Christianity and began his new career as a revivalist preacher. In the later half of the 20th century, we see this with another Billy, this one, Billy Graham, who continued to advance the notion of evangelical crusades.
The evangelical crusades and revivals of the 20th century found an easy partner with non-denominational churches. These non-denoms were easy to start and easy to join. Non-denominational and community churches seem rather easy to join. They're engaging and typically not seen as radical. Many of the names of these churches are fairly generic, either being taken from a landmark or a feature of the town, or possibly a vague biblical expression or sentiment. I've actually had personal discussions with some of these churches where they told me the idea of the name of their church came from wanting to sound as generic and non-offensive as possible. They wanted it to sound just as much like the name of a business park, but add the words community church tagged on to it. Many of these start off fairly small and are not sponsored by an established denomination. As such, they are completely independent, but also completely dependent on some other sources for growth. The percentage of their growth usually happens because of a split from a larger church. Other growth takes place because of a degree of marketing and people deciding to check them out. Flyers, usually around the time of Christmas or Easter, might work, at least to some measure. For much of the 20th century, a large amount of the new people came from large revivals that they would attach themselves to.
Crusades would come into town and drive up enthusiasm, and people needed churches to then join. These crusaders fueled church growth, but didn't have a church there. And while not all of these numbers, were positive, or as great as one might expect, a good number of people did sign up or join because of a crusade, even though, again, many might not ever attend again. Their names were now on a roll and could be reached out to in the future. For those that did actually get engaged, they usually brought a certain level of enthusiasm into the church that they joined. This could be very good, or in some cases also fairly bad. Enthusiasm usually feeds small churches, but the call for revivalism can also lay the groundwork for a schism in a larger church. For larger and more established churches, when a revival comes to town, one group or another is usually pushed out. This is one of the reasons why there are so many non-denominational and independent churches in the United States. Typically, this is harder with churches who are under the authority of a bishop, but splinter groups do happen in many of these as well. It is also fairly easy to start a new church in today. It's pretty easy to sign a lease on a strip mall space or to rent out a gym at a local school. Not all churches survive. A 1985 report demonstrated that of the 417 American-born sects that year, nearly a third of them, 32% to be precise, were the largest they ever were on the day that they were founded. In other words, they never grew, and they either stayed that size or shrunk. Most of these came off of different Baptist or Pentecostal churches. With all the competition for Protestant membership, the 20th century saw a rapid decline for mainline Protestants. While there was an increase in church affiliation, people, generally, did not choose to affiliate themselves with the main line. Raw numbers may have grown for most churches, but if we look at the market share, we see the trends were against the main line and for the evangelical and other church bodies, primarily the largest rise amongst the Pentecostals. Giving you some actual statistics here, the Episcopal Church market share dropped 51% between the year 1940 and 2000. The United Methodists dropped by 56%. The Presbyterian Church USA dropped by 60%. The Congregationalists dropped by 66%. And the Disciples of Christ fared the worse with a drop of 79% in market share. Those that grew are generally the evangelical group and really the Pentecostals. The Southern Baptists saw a slight gain of 37%. The Church of the Nazarene had a growth of 63%. The greatest growth took place amongst the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, with a growth of 501% in market share. The Churches of God in Christ grew 1,292% in market share, and the Pentecostal assemblies of the world growing 2,375%. Now, it's important to also understand when we're talking about market share, if you were down at 1% and you just nudge that up into 5%, that's a tremendous growth. But we see this trend happening away from one and towards another. For the record, other non-mainline groups grew as well. Mormons grew by 157% and the Jehovah's Witnesses by 200% during that same time period. Many mainline churches were choosing to respond to the loss of membership by adopting more conservative practices that are found among the evangelicals while trying to maintain the culture and history of their denomination. Charles W. Kessler in the United Methodist Church founded the Good News movement. This movement began with an article in the Methodist publication discussing the silent minority of evangelical Methodists in 1965. The response was a flood of other evangelical Methodists. This spurred on the creation of a Good News magazine, national conferences, and the Evangelical Mission Council. Unlike the holiness churches that were then pushed out of the MEC in the 19th century or chose to split off on their own, the Good News movement remained within the United Methodists. This then made its way towards the confessing movement in 1994 that had an emphasis on growth and vitality in the United Methodists. The Presbyterians followed with their own confessing church movement in 2001. Most of this change towards an evangelical version of mainline churches is started and sustained by younger clergy. The results have shown growth where traditional practices and greater commitments were required. The fact that it's coming from younger clergy is surprising to most, but shows that the idea of abandoning everything and accepting modernity, it doesn't really have an appeal for a younger or newer generation. One way to avoid division and continued presence of market share of religion is through cooperation. Both evangelical and mainline churches saw benefit in ecumenism in the post-war period. The word ecumenical grew to dominate all church polity in the 1950s and 60s, and even a little bit later than that. Sociologist Peter Berger actually commented in 1963 that denominational differences in America had become nothing more than, quote, functionally irrelevant embellishments and packaging. While the differences still existed, Berger's comments reflect the belief that American Protestantism had undergone a sort of flattening process of standardization. This is much more true amongst the main line than it was amongst the evangelicals, but even then there's a flattening. In the post-war period, this standardization allowed for even greater mergers to be proposed. The largest merger that was ever proposed was the planned merger of the Presbyterian Church USA, the Protestant Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, also known as the Congregationalists, in 1960. The proposal was titled the Consultation of Church Union. Though this merger never actually took place, it kind of shows the biggest proposed union that was ever really kind of attempted. What we see is that churches who did not see growth in the 20th century were more willing to merge with different denominations than those who are not. Yet, we might see that Lutherans might be more willing to merge with Lutherans as Lutherans continue to grow, but they didn't support an ecumenical union with others that were not Lutherans themselves. Same thing could be said amongst the Baptists, who also saw growth. They're willing to merge with other Baptists, but not with groups that weren't Baptist. Generally, growing churches still saw that difference mattered between them and other denominations, while those that were shrinking increasingly did not. Historian, pastor, and chair of the theological faculty at Southern Methodist University's Perkins School of Theology, William Warrant Sweet, said, quote, "The most widely used term in American Protestantism since the end of World War II is the word ecumenical. This happens," he says, "worldwide. Never before has the word Protestantism been so conscious of this world obligation. The vast destruction," he says, "both spiritual and moral, wrought by the war has brought to American Protestantism especially a new sense of mission. Out of the realization that Protestantism faces a world-demanding united front, there is emerging the World Council of Churches, largely under American Protestant leadership and inspiration. This first formed in 1948. One of the main terms that is used over and over again when discussing ecumenism and the ecumenical movement of the later half of the 20th century is the phrase separated brethren. Often the term is connected with Protestant interdenominationalism or with the tacit acceptance of Protestantism implicit in Vatican II. The term is actually much older than the 20th century. It was first used in any sort of note by Pope Leo XIII, who used it in a letter to the English-speaking church in 1895. Later in the 20th century, the movement was tied in with Protestant attempts at union. This actually goes back to the very beginning of the Protestant Reformation, with attempts made by Luther and Zwingli at union, which ultimately failed at the Marburg Colloquy on the issue of the real presence in the Eucharist, and later attempts at union in Berlin with the Union Church, as well as attempts made by Leibniz and others in the 19th century. The ecumenism inherent in the camp meetings and the teachings of the holiness movement was an organic American movement to try to bring together disparate Protestant denominations. The main technique was often in minimizing the difference and approaching union on what could be agreed upon. Several Protestant groups even began the practice of open communion, where they would not openly have a pulpit affiliation, but would share communion with all professing Christians at church. This was a radical departure. After all, not having communion was the main way that you showed that you were different than somebody else. And yet, now in the 19th century camp meetings in 20th century, the practice slowly grew. Typically, this was done only by those who did not adhere to the belief in the real presence of the Eucharist, though. By the 21st century, you actually had groups such as the ELCA also adopt this practice, who also affirmed the real presence in the Eucharist. This is a novelty in church history and a practice that really did not gain any sort of acceptance until the late 20th century, though for many evangelical churches it seems normal. On the other side of the dialogue, but still engaged with the ecumenical movement, you had many leading voices in conservative Lutheranism, the Missouri Synod, Roman Catholic Church, and Eastern Orthodox Church as well, who sought a genuine engagement with the belief that there is an ontological link between all Christians, but the divisions need to be reconciled for real unity. Eastern Orthodox Christian priest Father George Florowski was a leading voice and architect of the Orthodox ecumenism. In many ways, he typifies the response of many concerned who were committed to ecumenical dialogue, but warned against any endeavor that settled for doctrinal minimalism or avoided actual theological confrontations. Famously, Florowski pointed out that too many people placed an emphasis on either the term brethren or separated, but never really took them both together or in harmony. Part of the hope for ecumenical movements is not pretending that there is no difference, but in coming to a place where real agreement is made and the causes for schism genuinely end.
Despite the critique from the rising fundamentalists, Pentecostalism continued to grow throughout the 20th century. The holiness theology was adapted by the British Methodist William Cook, who argued that God's holiness was a specific type of glory. Cook identified this as Shekinah. Shekinah is a loose transliteration of the Hebrew term connected with God's Spirit resting upon the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies in the temple. The term is used to address God settling in a place and sanctifying it. Cook applied this idea to Palmer's altar theology. From here, it was used to describe nearly any powerful manifestation of God among the holiness movement during the later half of the 19th century, including the Azusa Street revival at the beginning of the 20th. Pentecostalism also grew amongst many disenfranchised Americans. That God's Shekinah glory would descend upon all regardless of race, gender, and economic status only served to accelerate the movement. Pentecostals are often called charismatics because of the excitement that their services produce. The egalitarian message opposed in word or practice by many established Protestant churches also served to provide an opportunity for the Pentecostals. The derisive connotations of Pentecostalism as illiterates, snake handlers, and holy rollers only served to disengage the weakening mainstream Protestants from understanding the surging Pentecostals. Throughout the 20th century,
Pentecostalism grew from a few revivals in Topeka and LA into a worldwide movement. By 1908, Pentecostalism revivals were found on 6 continents. 6 years later, the Assemblies of God was formed. The Assemblies of God is the largest Pentecostal denomination in the United States, and it is the engine for growth of many of the Pentecostal revivals throughout the world. In 1995, less than a century after its inception, there were over 200 million Pentecostals around the world attached to a Pentecostal denomination, and another 250 million who are associated with charismatic or holiness movements. The same disaffection with modernism and racial, gender, and economic segregation found in America is present throughout all of the world and helped to fuel this growth.
Part of what fueled Pentecostalism was a change from Pentecostalism in 1900 following World War II. New Pentecostalism found inroads in other Protestant and even Catholic circles by emphasizing the Pentecostal experience. Early on, we have examples from Aimee Semple McPherson, who streamlined Pentecostal message and founded the Foursquare Gospel Church and built the Angelus Temple in LA. The temple was dedicated in 1923. One of the most significant men to advance the Pentecostal experience was Oral Roberts. Roberts was initially ordained in a Holiness Wesleyan denomination, the Pentecostal Holiness Church. From there, he began a faith healing ministry in 1948. In 1951, Roberts and Demos Shakarian founded the Full Gospel Businessman Fellowship in LA. The idea was to expand Pentecostalism among the laity in hopes that the congregations would then accept them. And they did in 1956. A Presbyterian minister informed his congregation that he had experienced the gift of tongues, something for a Presbyterian would have seemed very radical in any other era. Dennis J. Bennett, an Episcopalian, also told his 2,000-member California church that he had a Pentecostal experience. Similar exclamations were made by Lutheran and Dutch Reformed congregations as well. All of a sudden, the notion of Pentecostalism was not just marginal, but found inroads within places that it would never have envisioned itself being at the beginning of the 20th century. Oral Roberts performed his healing services on TV from 1954 to 1967, declaring that the day of the tent revivals has passed. It was now the era of TV. To further aid acceptance of Pentecostalism, he joined the United Methodists and then founded Oral Roberts University in 1967. This is the first charismatic university. The university and surrounding area of Tulsa, Oklahoma, focused not only on Pentecostalism and faith healing, but also on how they can integrate themselves into the new American life. As such, the basketball team was nurtured and made appearances in 7 NCAA tournaments as of 2023. The furthest team ever made it was to the Elite Eight in 1974 before losing to Kansas. Roberts also incorporated a racially mixed group of singers, as well as brought in Hollywood celebrities to elevate the notions of Pentecostalism from the poor and working class roots of Parham and Seymour to a more uptown expression. In 1979, Gallup reported that 29 million Americans called themselves either Pentecostals or Charismatics, and 6 million said they had spoken in tongues. Roberts built upon all of the work done within earlier, but formed a new expression of Pentecostalism. Similar to the NAE, another organization had emerged to advance evangelicalism, this one titled Youth for Christ. Youth for Christ was founded in 1943 and held social events for the youth and served to recruit and train a new generation of evangelical leadership.
Other similar groups started emerging in both the United States and elsewhere. Probably one of the most dominant names is InterVarsity Fellowship, which came to America in 1940 from England and exploded with more than 600 chapters on college and university campuses. One of the success marks that you can see is that 12,000 students showed up at their Christmas gathering in 1970 at the University of Illinois. In 1977, that number continued to grow to 17,000. Another organization focused on youth and college experience was the Campus Crusade for Christ, which was founded in LA at the UCLA campus in 1951 by Bill Bright. Campus Crusade's Expo conference saw more than 75,000 people attend in the summer of 1972 in Dallas. Not a time that you'd want to go to Dallas, but yet 75,000 people showed up. From there, Campus Crusade launched an evangelicalistic billboard bumper sticker campaign in 1976 with the phrase, "I found it." 85% of Americans encountered this campaign. 2 years later, it spread to over 100 different countries. And in 2012, Campus Crusade for Christ officially changed its name to Cru, where you might know it at different campuses today. In 1965, Bill Bright also wrote a famous religious tract called The Four Spiritual Laws. This was printed up and distributed more than 2.5 billion copies. It is the most widely distributed religious tract in history. In the tract, Bright posits that just as there are laws of nature, there are spiritual laws as well. These laws begin with the first statement that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. Then they move to the notion of sin causing separation, Christ's death as the only provision for man's sin, and everyone individually receiving Christ to experience God's love and plan for their lives. The tract demonstrates a shift in evangelical thinking. Instead of emphasizing scholarship, trying to prove inerrancy of the Bible or some other large theological concept, the push was now to get people to understand a very simple message and to act to it. At the local congregation, evangelical pastors and laity are emerging and calling for a return to a more traditional teaching. This led to another brand of American holiness churches that is identifying itself now as the emergent church. The emergent church is dependent upon the Christian legacy of existentialism and postmodern thought, often identifying themselves as post-Protestant, post-evangelical, post-liberal, and post-conservative. The emergent church is filled with postmodern angst and desires something new to come out of a vaguely evangelical and non-denominational church. Unlike fundamentalists or Pentecostals who believe that they're living the Christianity of the New Testament through strict interpretation of the Bible or a second Pentecost, the emergent church is content to live in the 21st century with the technological advances and morality of the modern world. While accepting modernity, there is some nostalgia for older forms of Christianity, usually pre-Protestant Christianity, often borrowing practices from Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics. The emergent churches lambast Protestant reformers' use and notions of iconoclasm and reinstates images and use of candles and incense in church services. There's an attempt to synthesize the form of medieval piety with the function of modern evangelical churches. Multimedia displays and rock concert worship are paired with tapers and medieval prayer books. By holding these two distinct eras together, emergent churches believe that there's a new authenticity found in their worship. Many notions of liberalism and neoliberalism are also present, including biblical criticism and placing Christianity within a cultural framework instead of a confessional or doctrinal one. When creeds are used, they are not used as declarations of faith that differentiate the believer from the non-believer, but a communal recital akin to a repeated prayer. Not surprising, many of the emerging churches originated in the same areas that the holiness movement was the strongest, and traditionalism outweighed denominational ties. Tim Keel, who pastors an emergent church in Kansas City, Jacob's Well, argues, quote, "The emerging church phenomena is but one small example of an alternative attempt to engage reality. The emerging church strives to refathom who God is, what the gospel is, how we access and read scripture, what it means to be human, and how to generate a common life in the midst of creation in response to these realities." To this end, many emergent churches do not use the term church, but rather view themselves as spiritual formation centers, focusing less on proselytizing than on personal growth. Critics have asked if they are emerging churches or submerging churches, as one example of new attempts of deconstructing and reconstructing Christianity in America. The 20th century actually presented a great mix of theology and practice for Protestants, as well as different religious movements all over the globe. We can ask a lot of different questions about the growth of religion in the 20th century. Probably the first question that should be asked is this any different than any other periods of history, or is it more of the same? Is it that we simply just have more media to take this all in? We have more documented cases because there's just more documented cases. Were the attempts of ecumenical dialogue also a genuine sign of cooperation, or are they a sign of decline? Also, how do we explain the high rate of religious engagement over this period compared to every other period of history? Is this a blessing of God? That works as an answer. Or you might say it's a response to a blessing of God. Or you might say it's completely independent or just something else. There's also questions about what will the effect be of continual theological debates and expressions of evangelicalism. Ultimately, is this going to help build up a stronger, more robust church? Or does the idea of simplifying and trying to market and sell things, is that something that's ultimately going to hurt? We don't know the answer to these questions. We won't know for another century, but we definitely, at least from looking at all these things, can see that these are worthwhile questions to ask.